Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. On these Wednesday night studies together, we've been working through the Gospel of Matthew, and we've come to a section now where we start what we call chapter 7. Jesus just would have thought about it as his next words in his sermon. And this is, unfortunately, it's become one of the most controversial and most talked about passages in all the Bible. In fact, we might venture a guess to say that Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, at least part of it, the shortened version of it, has become the most well-known Bible verse in the whole world, even more so than John 3:16. Because in Matthew 7:1, Jesus says, judge not. He says more than that, but people know those words. And I think in our society, especially in our modern age, we've lost the ability to have a rational argument in a lot of circles with other people and to be able to have a conversation with people. We want to very quickly engage in ad hominem argumentation, just to label them and to make, talk about a person's reputation or character rather than have a reasoned discussion based on logic and facts about issues. And so when you get into a text like this, I think one of the things that leaps out at us as readers is to know that one of the quickest ways you can spark an argument in our society is to simply say words like, I don't agree with that, or, you're wrong. I think you're wrong, and here's why. Or maybe even to go so far as to say, I think you have sin in your life. And anytime you do something like that, the very quick reply is for somebody to say, judge not. In fact, I thought you were a Christian, and the Bible says, judge not. And so you need to be reading your own book. And so I think we're living in an age where there's a real lack of tolerance. Tolerance is actually not a bad thing. We tolerate one another every day, even as the closest of friends. There are ways in which we tolerate each other. But I think some people who talk about tolerance are, ironically, the most intolerant of people. Because they would say we should all be more tolerant. And yet, when you disagree with them, then they become very, very intolerant, and they will say, you are so intolerant, which is such an ironic statement because they themselves are demonstrating their intolerance. And so, I think true tolerance is something that the world could use a whole lot more of, more understanding, more ability to have reasoned discussion, more ability to disagree and to give reasoning why. But here's this verse, judge not, and it's used by people when you disagree with them. It's thrown back in a Christian's face in order for them to be able to say to you, mind your own business. Keep your opinion to yourself because it doesn't agree with mine. I want you to think about this passage in a couple of different ways. To me, as a reader of the Bible, I am absolutely shocked that this text is of any controversy whatsoever. I can only surmise that a person reads verse 1 and does not read anything else in the chapter to have any confusion whatsoever on this issue of judgment. At the outset, Jesus is talking about judging, and he's talking especially about people who do so in a condescending way from a position of arrogance and hypocrisy. And I cannot get past the idea that when Jesus actually is saying these words, he must at least have thought for a fleeting moment about the Pharisees and how they not only treated him, but probably treated most people in the society of that day. The Pharisees are the ones who, the most Bible-saturated people on planet Earth, and yet they went around very often, some of them, very influential ones at least, seem to go around with a lot of condescension and a lot of condemnation. Matthew 23, verse 4, Jesus says they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, and they themselves are not willing to move them with their fingers. So they were hypocritical. And so when Jesus is saying, you're judging from a hypocritical stance. And so this is, I think, part of the reason why he says in verse 2, with the judgment you use, it will be used back on you. And so we should take great care in how we approach people. So that's one type of judging, and Jesus is very clear about being careful against it. On the other hand, as you read through the rest of the chapter, Jesus makes it very, very clear that we are to look at things that are right and wrong and true teaching and false teaching, and we are to be able to recognize those things and evaluate those things and compare those things by the right standard. And so we're talking about a couple of different things that are very, very obvious in the text when you read the whole chapter. On the one hand, Jesus looks at those in power and says, judge not from a stance of hypocrisy. Do not be condescending. Do not, judge from a position of condemnation. Don't make assumptions about people. Do not issue false comparisons. On the other hand, when it comes to true teaching and that which is true, and false teaching and that which is false, evaluate it, compare it, recognize it according to God's word. So let's be clear. Number one, proper judging, and by that word we mean comparing right and wrong. That's part of following Jesus. Listen, if we didn't do that in everyday life, we would very easily find our lives in danger just by being careless. But especially when we come to the teaching of God, it's commanded. It's a part of following Jesus. And yet our detractor may, fire back, but didn't Jesus say, judge not? Again, you're not reading the whole chapter. Notice verse 5. If you judge from a stance of hypocrisy, take the log out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. And don't, verse 6, give that which is holy to the dogs, or toss your pearls before pigs. They'll trample them under feet, turn and tear you to pieces. But rather, verse 13, enter through the narrow gate. The gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. My question to you is, Jesus expects you to be able to distinguish between what is the narrow gate and what's the wide gate. How do you know that? You have to make a judgment, a value judgment. You have to make a comparison. You have to make a recognition between those things. And so when we get to a little further down, and he's sort of moved away from this issue of judging from a stance of hypocrisy and arrogance. Now he's talking about evaluating what is true and false. And so when you get down in verses 15 and 16, he says, be on your guard against what? False prophets. How are you supposed to know that? You have to make a judgment about their teaching. He says, they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravening wolves. And so you'll recognize them by your fruit. So we use this word recognition. There's a type of judgment that must be done. That's a recognition. There's a type of judgment which must never be done, which is hypocritical and false. And so Jesus talks about a true judgment. Down in verse 22, on that day, that is the day of reckoning, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Cast out demons in your name? Do many mighty works in your name? None of those things counted because they were functioning from a place of falsehood. So proper judging, that is recognizing and comparing, is part of following Jesus. He commands it. Second thing we could say is that proper judging requires the proper standard, which is the word of Christ. Faith comes from hearing especially the word of Christ. Romans 10:17. And in context, Jesus means especially the sermon he's preaching. And I think especially he has in mind, we should build our foundation on the rock of Jesus' words. And we should not be, and here's another text, John 7, verse 24. Do not judge by appearances. Don't be hypocritical. Do not judge condescendingly, that is with condemnation, with assumptions, false comparisons. But in the very next words, John 7:24, judge, that's the command. You are commanded to judge. Judge with right judgment. You're to be able to tell the difference between what's right and wrong, true and false. And so we'll read in a text like 1 John chapter 4, verse 1, Beloved, do not believe every spirit. I've encountered people in my life where it's so frustrating because they think God is speaking to their heart. God told me this, or God told maybe something did tell you that, but which spirit told you that? Maybe it was a false spirit. And John writes, and he says, test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. So proper judging is commanded. It has to be done by the right standard, the word of Christ. It has to be done from the right frame of heart, humility. All of us have strong beliefs and opinions, and arguments are very easily brought about when we have strong opinions. And we have to be cautious and kind and loving. And I love what Jesus says when he says, the application of the golden rule applies in every frame of life. Treat others as you would have them treat you. I think we're tempted to read into the behaviors of others. Maybe it is really true. We can deal harshly with somebody, sometimes very unfairly. But I think we have to have this understanding that there's a proper understanding of judgment, that you must be able, Matthew 7:16, to recognize them by their fruit. God's expectation is that we will humbly compare right and wrong and true and false. And so these are things we must take into account. And so I think when we think about this issue of judging, I think it's very important for us to be gentle in our application of it, to apply the golden rule in all cases. Galatians 6:1, Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. And so I think it's important for us to understand there's a wrong way to judge and there's a right way to judge. Jesus teaches them both in Matthew 7. There should be no controversy about it. It's right here in the text and it's easy to understand. But in our application of this, we must be humble, we must be gentle, and we must be gracious. We must approach people who are caught in error with a spirit of gentleness, Galatians 6:1. I think it's hard to do that when you yourself have not had a need to be forgiven, or when you're not thinking about it. And I think you'll never really understand grace as a concept until you first meet grace as a person. When you understand your own need for mercy and gentleness, then it's much easier to grant it to others. In Jesus' name, His love is burning in our hearts like living flame. For through the loving Son, the Father makes us one. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord. No